Hello guys, my name is Jose de Vera. I am an artist and educator working in Southern California, and I'll be collaborating with Self-Help Graphics to bring you today's workshop, where I'll be talking about subtractive paintings on non-absorbent ground. Now, I know that sounds sort of technical, but it's actually really simple, really streamlined, and actually kind of fun. So let me show you some examples of what I mean. Um, Here's kind of a landscape. As you can see, it's kind of gritty, very loose, also done very fast, and incorporates a lot of kind of gritty, dynamic textures. I think it has a lot of potential in one's art practice by either making finished pieces or being a process to kind of generate larger paintings or something just to work out ideas. I think it's a really great skill to have in my own practice, and hopefully for yours as well. So let's take a look at the materials we're going to need, and then we're going to jump into the lesson plan. So bear with me as I kind of shift the angle of the camera to give you a better view of what exactly you'll need. Okay guys, really quick, before we get into the project itself, let's talk about the materials we're going to need. All right? So probably most important is the ground we're going to use, or the surface we're going to be painting on. So we're going to be using a non-absorbent ground, meaning that our paint or pigment isn't going to absorb into the surface, not like canvas. So this particular sheet is a plastic sheet made by a company called Duralar. Specifically, here is the pad that I got it from, and I cut them in half. And I think it goes also by the name of Mylar. Yupo has something similar in terms of texture, but Duralar is usually what I use. So as you notice, not only is it plastic, it's also semi-translucent. And it also has a little bit of bite. So it's going to help our pigment sort of adhere. It also takes to graphite pretty well. So if you want to draw on it, you can. It's a great surface for that. It has a lot of potential in that because it's semi-translucent or semi-transparent, you can cut them up and layer them, use them for collage projects, etc. But in this case, we're going to use it to be painting on. So, okay. So I'll leave that here. So we're going to need a few more basic things. We're going to be using oil paints. So that is sort of essential because unlike acrylic paints, oil paints dry slowly. So you're going to need oil paint so you can move the paint around on the surface. If you're using acrylic, it is possible. It's just a little bit more challenging and the paints dry faster. So with sort of my default oil painting setup, I'm going to have this kind of pan palette that I'm going to use. I don't need a really big one for this one, so this one's sort of just a study palette. You can see it's sort of messy. I have two brushes, one big one and one smaller one for details. Of course, the oil pigments. This is just an old Winsor Newton indigo that I'm going to use. You can use black or any other darker pigment for your project that you have available. But in this case, I like the cool dark tones of indigo. And I'm going to use what's traditionally called in painting as a three-part medium. It's sort of a substance that helps your paint flow a little bit more free. And I'm using three-part medium. I'm using specifically for me Gamsol, an alkyd, and walnut oil. Now, this can be done just, you can use just linseed oil or just some safflower oil mixed in with a little bit of thinner as your medium, but this is particularly what I like to use during when I'm in my oil paints. And if you really want a thinner as well to clean your brushes or to get a little bit more leverage in picking paint up of the non-absorbent ground, you can use turpentine, which is a little bit harsher. I'm using just Gamsol, the same Gamsol that I put in here. Gamsol is a great thinner because it's actually odorless, so it's less toxic, or at least gives off less fumes that are toxic. But still, please be in a well-ventilated area if you are doing oil paints. It's just, it's in the long run, it's much healthier. There are still some petroleum distillates in the vehicles of these oil paints and spirits. So it's good to be in a well-ventilated area. All right. So another really important thing actually, is the use of some sort of multi-purpose cleaning wipe. I like to use Gojo, this sort of industrial fast wipe towelette. Not only is it great to get grease off your hands, here it is, but it's actually the main sort of tool we're going to use to paint on. So essentially, what I'm going to be showing you in this process, I'm going to grab an example here. Here's kind of one of the examples I showed you earlier. We're going to be laying down a coat of pigment, and then instead of adding the details, we're going to initially subtract, right? We're going to take off the paint off the surface. That is why we need a non-absorbent ground, and that's also why what we're using the rags, the towelettes or rags for, right? So we kind of get this a different kind of effect. Here's another example of what I showed you earlier. You see it's really loose. It's not something that you can be very tight with, although you might be more successful than me in doing that. But and it's also very fast, making it ideal for quick sketches or quick layouts of paints. So many, many things. So, all right, let's jump into the lesson itself. All right, so let's move on to the lesson. Here we have our Durlar sheet, as you can see. It's the sheet we'll be painting on, obviously. So we'll be looking to replicate one of the examples from earlier. It's this portrait. It's actually sourced from this Rembrandt workshop printout. So we'll be doing a master copy as an example. Now you're free to use any sort of portrait you want, or it doesn't even have to be a portrait, but kind of, your own source imagery. But for this specific example, I'm going to do this particular portrait. So here I'm going to tape up some of the sides. I'm going to tape them to this chipboard that I have as backing to help me paint at an angle using masking tape. So you may need masking tape if you want to do this part, but by no means is it essential. You can also just paint directly on your desk surface, a flat surface. Just make sure you have something to protect probably your desk from the paints from spilling everywhere, maybe some newsprint. As you can see, I'm having trouble with the painter's tape here. Bear with me. Trying to get it as straight as reasonably possible. So just as a tip for all you painters out there, if you're using painter's tape, try to get the edges flush onto the surface. You kind of want to do that so it prevents the pigment from bleeding through the painter's tape. So if you want a crisp edge, make sure you kind of flatten that edge. Also, as some of you might have noticed, there are you can hear sort of faint airplanes in the background. I do live next to an airfield, so that's what that is. So I apologize. Just try your best to kind of ignore it. All right, so working our way through with the tape. One more side. So again, we're making sure, try to get rid of any air bubbles or sort of space between the tape and the ground there. So now I'm going to be using, again, we're using oils. So I'll be using my indigo paint right here. And feel free for you to use, black or any of the darker pigments that you may have available. I'm just using indigo because I do like I said, the sort of the cooler darks. And I'm just going to apply it using a brush um, with a little bit of the medium that we discussed earlier. Get the pigment to flow a little bit better and sort of directly apply that onto my ground. If it's easier, if you have a larger brush available, you can use that too. I should probably use a larger brush to kind of fill this area in, probably wouldn't take as much time. But, it's a pretty straightforward process. Get a nice layer of pigment right on that sheet of Duralar. So you do want to cover the entire surface with as even as possible tone. And once that's done, we can actually start our subtractive process, where we'll be using this towelette. So this specifically is the Gojo Industrial Wipes. And again, you can use sort of any sort of cleaning wipes. Make sure it's not, Clorox based. And we'll also actually want to use gloves with this. So if you have gloves, please use them just to be safe. So using those wipes, you're going to simply kind of shape it to how you want them to be and begin taking out the pigment to sort of correspond with the lighter areas of the form. So if this part of the process feels sort of awkward, don't worry, it's supposed to. You're just simply looking for the bigger shapes of light, and you're not going to really bother with the smaller details till later on. So a good technique to try to kind of find the large areas of light, you can kind of squint and look at your source image, and that will get rid of some of the details that your mind kind of might focus on or gets distracted with. So you can also shape the rag slash towelette to kind of fit the shape you want it to kind of draw on the surface. So if you want a finer line, you can fold it, or if you want a wider line, you can kind of expose a wider edge. And you can also kind of shift the pressure on how you hold the rag so you can control the tonal values. So if you want the lighter areas to come through a bit more, you can just go over the surface again with the solvent rag or the cleaning rag and picking up more of the pigment. So that's why this process is a subtractive process in which you're actually taking away pigment from the surface rather than adding it. Now, that being said, we don't strictly have to stick to the subtractive process. We can also use a brush to make corrections and add more pigment to wherever we see needs more tone. And you can also do this to add more details, kind of carve out edges, however you see fit. So while this is mainly a subtractive process, it's actually a process in which uses a sort of a push-pull, give and take method. So here I'm gonna define a little bit more of the facial features once I've gotten sort of the larger forms taken care of. And for this method, you kind of want to work from big forms to small. And what I mean by that is looking at sort of the big blocks of shapes and then working within them, um, slowly defining the smaller shapes and smaller details as you go. So here I'm working my way through the mouth, nose area, trying to really look at the values and how they shift. And you know what? It's not going to be exactly like the painting or the original source photo. And you know, that's okay, because the nature of this exercise is to kind of use it as a tool and not really to make it look exactly like the picture. It's kind of, taking something and making it your own. So here I'm going to define the background, so make sure you do that as well. So this exercise is also good because it forces you to kind of define the negative and positive shapes and open and closed spaces and be more sensitive to it and really try to find it within the painting itself. And it's really important to not try to be too precious in regards to kind of your marks and be fluid. Because if you make a mistake, you can always add in the pigment. Or if you add in the pigment and you sort of add too much, you can always take away. So it's a very forgiving method. So play around and sort of have fun. Here you can kind of see I've gotten the majority of the large parts and I'm just kind of refining the details and really trying to get the values somewhat where I want them to be. But I'm also not, spending an entire time getting lost in one part of the image. I'm kind of working my way through all around the image, making sure that it works as a whole instead of getting lost in one area. And at this point, you can also use your brush to kind of move the pigment around, the existing pigment around, to get a more subtle value in tone. So if you want sort of a gray area, you can use a brush that doesn't have a lot of paint on it and kind of move around the paint that's already on the Duralar on the surface and kind of move it around. And really use that non-absorbent surface to your advantage. I mean, the paint is just sitting there. You're free to kind of push and move it around as you wish. So like I mentioned before, I'm not using any white or any other sort of light pigment to get my highlight. So if I really wanted to highlight kind of pop, I'm going to kind of use my solvent or cleaning rag to kind of pick up that pigment in that area and get it to pop. And if I wanted some more details, I go back into it with a brush. Also, just an FYI, a lot of this will just be sort of a process of me painting. So if you want to, if you have a fast forward feature and you want to just kind of see that process without a lot of dead air, feel free to do so. So at this point, I'm just continuing with really putting on the minute finishing touches of where I feel I need this to be. But, I probably don't need to work on this much moving forward after kind of where I'm at right now. Simply because, I got kind of the large ideas and I'm just going over trying to get the little details in. And you can spend, forever doing the little details, but um, that's up to you of how far you can take this. You can actually make a very tightly rendered painting. You can go back over this when it's dry and paint another layer and add another effect. You can also paint the underside of it, and once it's dry, and get kind of a cool effect because it's translucent. The paper itself is semi-translucent, but it's strictly up to you. yeah, and that's pretty much it. Maybe a little bit more refining in terms of trying to get some of that pigment out, really define sort of the folds of the clothing here. But yeah, it's pretty much where I want to be. And let me reposition the camera here, or reposition the painting to give you a better view of it. It's kind of at an angle, I know. All right, probably just a little bit more adjustments to that corner, but done. Yeah. So here's what it looks like. Here, let me show you the source image real quick. There's a finished piece. So yeah, it's pretty fast. Not a lot of time. It's a great way to kind of hash out composition problems or any painting ideas you want to figure out before you tackle on something bigger. But let's take a look at um, that landscape that we kind of showed you earlier. Let's see if we can do that as well. So we'll place that as sort of our new source image. And tell you what, let's use, oops, there goes the other source image. Let's use this same surface. Because it is non-absorbent and because it is a kind of a subtractive method, you can actually just wipe down the surface clean if you're not really happy with the image. So that's exactly what I'll do. I'll take another cleaning rag and wipe the surface down, and we can make our landscape on it. So let me kind of use a new rag and wipe away this old image. And it's okay, it didn't take a lot of time, so if I wanted to make that image again, I'll just do it again. And this makes it so that nothing is really set in stone. You can really make a lot of mistakes and erase them and do it over. It's a really, again, very forgiving process, and that's a good thing. So with this, I'll try to scrub it as well as I can, but it doesn't need to be perfect, really. It just needs to be at a place where you can paint over it. So similar to the first part, we're going to go back over the surface with pigment, in this case indigo paint, using my medium to get the paint a little bit more flowing. And make sure that we get a nice covered working surface. Once that's done, we're gonna, just like the previous example, we're gonna take out the pigment we don't like, or kind of areas where there's light shining through. And again, you want to carve out vaguely sort of the big shapes that will inform your landscape. Feel free to play around, make happy little trees if you want. Or in this case, I'm sort of making this sort of abandoned / ruined, what looks like to be a village, just to simply kind of keep in the theme of our previous example. But feel free to experiment at any point, again, in this exercise. We're really not looking for a refined piece at this point. We're really trying to capture a more gestural approach that the subtractive process is really good at. And don't be afraid to be expressive with your marks and use that to your advantage. Now for the landscape, particularly, which is different from the portrait, I really have to be sensitive in trying to figure out where my foreground elements are. So generally foreground elements have, higher contrast, so they're lighter lights, sometimes darker darks than background elements. So you kind of have to play with that as well. I like to play with the texture. I kind of use the texture of the rag that I'm using to kind of push the texture around of the paint, get those marks and lines, and find, in painting you hear the term happy accidents. Well, this is a process that you can get a lot of happy accidents if you really sort of look for them. So here at this stage, I'm just simply playing around seeing what works, shifting the paint around, editing it. If I need to, I'll add back into the landscape, but at this stage, I really just want to see the big shapes. So now that I have sort of structure, I'll come in with a smaller paintbrush and add in some added details and build the structure up. And again, it's up to you how tightly rendered you want to work your final image. You can add smaller details, linear marks, here some, scaffolding, or whatever you feel like your kind of composition needs. And similar to our example, I'm just going to make a figure in the foreground here. Just make the scene a little bit more dramatic. I'll just add one, but feel free to add as many things as you want, animals or whatever. You get the idea. It's, you can pretty much run with this and hopefully experiment and kind of play around. Again, really, I have to emphasize it's not going to look, or, initially it may not look as refined as you want it, and that's okay. That's part of the beauty of it. It really is a process that can contain a lot of movement and uses sort of this gestural method as one of its strengths. So at this stage, it helps to kind of stand back and look at your work from afar. So just to make sure you don't get tunnel vision, that's always a good thing to practice. And at this stage, I think, maybe I can refine, maybe turn that right structure, turn it more into a tree or something, and kind of work with that just a little bit more. But other than that, this is pretty much done. I don't really think I need to add more to it. Again, sort of, editing, really, the refinement process is a push and pull process. You're going to be adding and subtracting if you really want. And it's a good time to kind of hash out what sticks out in the foreground, what are your, compositionally, what elements you want to focus on, and ratchet down the details. So there you have it. All right, well, I just want to say thank you guys. Thanks for sticking with it. It was a lot of fun making this video, and hopefully it was a lot of fun for you guys viewing it. If there's anything I missed explaining the process, or is there anything you want to kind of learn more specifically, feel free to contact me. My contact information hopefully will be somewhere on this page. And, leave your comments or ask any kind of pertinent questions, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. But otherwise, have fun making art, and hopefully you guys will continue to support the arts, as well as organizations like Self-Help Graphics and the Veterans Art Project. So there you go.